The luxury restaurant was filled with wealthy guests that evening, but nobody paid attention to the elderly woman standing outside the entrance. Her clothes were old and worn, her gray hair was untidy, and she held a small cloth bag tightly against her chest. She had not eaten properly for 2 days. Her name was Margaret, a 70-year-old woman who had once lived a peaceful life with her husband and daughter, but after losing everything, she had slowly become invisible to the world. She had spent the entire afternoon searching for something to eat, and when she saw the expensive restaurant, filled with people leaving, plates of untouched food behind, she gathered enough courage to walk inside. The security guard immediately stepped in front of her, but Margaret quietly asked if she could have the leftovers from someone's table. She wasn't asking for money. She wasn't asking for a meal from the kitchen. She simply wanted whatever food the wealthy guests were going to throw away. At that exact moment, a billionaire businessman named Adrian Vale was sitting at the best table in the restaurant. Adrian was known for his enormous wealth, expensive suits, and ruthless business reputation, but few people knew that he secretly donated millions to shelters and food. Banks every year. He was having dinner with several executives when he noticed the commotion near the entrance. The manager was telling the old woman to leave, explaining that the restaurant was not a place for beggars. Adrian immediately stood up and asked what was happening. The manager nervously explained that the woman was asking for leftover food. Adrian looked toward Margaret and noticed that she wasn't behaving like someone trying to cause trouble. She was simply standing there with her head lowered, quietly waiting for an answer. Adrian told the manager to bring her a fresh meal instead. The entire table went silent when Adrian walked toward her himself and said, "You don't have to eat someone else's leftovers. Sit down. I'll have them prepare whatever you'd like." Margaret looked shocked. She thanked him but refused to sit at his table. Adrian asked why, and she quietly replied that she didn't want to make anyone uncomfortable. Adrian told her that she wasn't making anyone uncomfortable and personally pulled out a chair. Margaret finally sat down. As the restaurant staff brought her soup, bread, vegetables, and a warm meal, she ate slowly, almost as though she was afraid someone might take the food away. Adrian watched her without staring. He noticed that she kept her left arm close to her body and avoided moving it. When she reached for the bread, her sleeve slipped slightly, revealing a dark bruise around her wrist. Adrian immediately became concerned. He asked if she had been hurt. Margaret quickly pulled her sleeve down and said she had fallen. Adrian knew the explanation did not sound convincing. After Margaret finished eating, Adrian quietly offered to arrange transportation to a shelter. She refused again. He asked whether she had somewhere safe to sleep. Margaret hesitated before saying that she had a place, but she lowered her eyes when she said it. Adrian could tell she was hiding something. Before he could ask another question, Margaret accidentally dropped her cloth bag. Several old papers fell onto the floor. Adrian bent down to help her collect them, and one document caught his attention. It contained the name of a company Adrian recognized immediately. It was one of the companies he had recently acquired after its former owner mysteriously disappeared. Margaret noticed the document in Adrian's hand and became frightened. She quickly grabbed it and stood up. Adrian asked her why she had paperwork from that company. Margaret whispered that she should never have come inside. She turned toward the door, but Adrian gently stopped her and told her that she was safe. Margaret looked at him for several seconds before quietly saying, "You don't understand. They know I still have the evidence." Adrian's expression changed. He asked how, "Who knows?" Margaret looked around the restaurant, suddenly terrified that someone might be watching them. Then she whispered, "The people who killed my son." Adrian froze. Margaret revealed that her son had been an accountant working for the company before it collapsed. He had discovered that several executives were secretly moving millions of dollars through fake accounts. Before he could expose them, he disappeared. The authorities had called it an accident, but Margaret knew it wasn't. Her son had secretly given her a copy of the financial records before his death. She had hidden them for years because everyone who tried to help her had either disappeared or been threatened. Adrian asked why she had come to his restaurant specifically. Margaret looked at him with tired eyes and said, "Because your name was in my son's final file." Adrian's heart sank. He had believed he was investigating a simple corporate acquisition. Now he realized the company he had purchased might be connected to a murder, and Margaret's bruises suggested that someone had already discovered she was carrying the truth. Adrian immediately moved Margaret to a private room inside the restaurant. He ordered his security team to secure every entrance and asked the manager to keep the situation confidential. Margaret was still shaking as she explained everything she knew. Her son, Daniel, had worked as a senior accountant for the company Adrian had recently acquired. Daniel had discovered that billions of dollars had been disappearing through shell companies controlled by several senior executives. He had started copying documents and recording conversations because he believed the corruption went far beyond simple financial fraud. According to Margaret, Daniel had told her that someone inside the company was protecting the operation from the highest level. 2 days before he died, he had given Margaret a small, encrypted storage device and told her never to trust anyone connected to the company. Adrian asked where the device was. Margaret looked toward her cloth bag and said that she had hidden it somewhere. No one would think to search. She had been living in fear ever since Daniel's death. The bruises on her wrists were not from a fall. 2 men had found her several days earlier and demanded that she hand over the evidence. She refused, and they attacked her before leaving her on the street. Margaret had escaped only because a passing driver frightened them away. She had spent the following days hiding wherever she could, too afraid to contact the police because she believed someone inside the system was working with the criminals. Adrian listened carefully and realized that Margaret's story explained several strange things he had noticed since acquiring the company. He had been told that Daniel's financial records were incomplete, yet his own investigators had recently discovered unexplained gaps in the company's accounting system. Several senior executives had resigned immediately after Adrian's acquisition, claiming they wanted to retire. Now Adrian understood why. Someone had known that the new owner might eventually discover the truth. He promised Margaret that he would protect her and find out who was responsible for her son's death. But Margaret warned him not to trust anyone, including some of his own security staff. She told him that Daniel had once mentioned a senior executive who could make people disappear without leaving evidence behind. Adrian immediately called his most trusted investigator, Ethan, and asked him to quietly examine every name connected to Daniel's final investigation. Ethan soon discovered something disturbing. One of the company's former directors had transferred enormous sums of money into offshore accounts shortly before Daniel died. Even worse, that same director had recently contacted several people who had been involved in the company's operations after Adrian took control. While Ethan investigated, Adrian returned to Margaret. He told her that he had no intention of sending her back onto the streets. Margaret looked at him and asked why a billionaire would care so much about an old woman he had never met. Adrian answered honestly. He said that his money had allowed him to buy companies, houses, cars, and almost anything else he wanted, but it had never given him the ability to bring back someone who had been murdered. If he could prevent another family from experiencing that pain, he wanted to do it. Margaret finally reached inside the lining of her old cloth bag and pulled out a tiny encrypted device. She placed it in Adrian's hand. She told him that Daniel had warned her never to give it to anyone unless she was certain they truly wanted the truth. Adrian promised that he did. When Ethan decrypted the files, the evidence was overwhelming. It revealed a massive network of financial crimes, bribery, intimidation, and illegal transfers involving several executives. But one document shocked Adrian more than everything else. His own name appeared in the records. Adrian immediately believed someone had framed him. But the document showed that the criminal network had been planning to use his company acquisition as a way to move the remaining money into legitimate accounts. They had deliberately allowed Adrian to purchase the company so they could make him the public face of the operation. If the scheme succeeded, Adrian would take the blame while the real criminals disappeared with the money. Before Adrian could react, Ethan rushed into the room and warned him that someone had accessed the private security system. Someone knew Margaret was with them. Adrian immediately moved Margaret toward a secure exit, but the restaurant light suddenly went out. In the darkness, Margaret grabbed Adrian's arm and whispered, "They're here." Adrian told everyone to stay calm. His security team moved into position, and seconds later, the emergency lights came on. The doors were locked, and nobody could leave. Ethan checked the cameras and discovered that one of the restaurant's Private entrances had been opened from inside. Someone had betrayed them. Adrian looked at Margaret and realized that the woman who had walked into his restaurant asking for leftovers had unknowingly brought him the evidence that could destroy an entire criminal empire. By morning, the authorities had enough evidence to begin arrests. The former executives were taken into custody, the financial network was exposed, and Daniel's death was officially reopened as a murder investigation. Margaret was placed somewhere safe, and for the first time in years, she no longer had to look over her shoulder. Weeks later, Adrian visited her at a small, peaceful home he had arranged for her. Margaret smiled and told him that she still remembered the night she had entered his restaurant asking for scraps of food. Adrian smiled and said that she had walked into his restaurant hungry, but she had left carrying something much more important, the chance to finally tell the truth. Margaret looked at him and said, "Your leftovers saved my life." Adrian shook his head. "No," he replied. "Your courage saved the truth." And from that day forward, Margaret was never again treated as an invisible old woman on the street. She became the woman whose bruises exposed a deadly secret, brought down a powerful criminal network, and proved that sometimes the person society refuses to notice is the very person carrying the truth everyone else is afraid to face.